Grace and Peace. I'm Brian Musser, and the Baptist Campus Minister at Drexel University, and this is Peace and Power Bible Study. The peace of Jesus Christ to change your life, the power of the Holy Spirit to change the world. And we are looking at the good news. The gospel is good news for every person and every part of life. And as we've been looking through the gospel each week, we handle the gospel on a different topic. And this week we've been looking at the gospel and how it relates to missions, and how the gospel is relevant to every person throughout the world. And we looked in the last video at how the gospel was intended even as it launched the church to go to all nations and all peoples. This video, we're going to focus on how this was God's intended plan since the beginning of his dealings with people on earth. The gospel plan is not something new that only exists since Jesus. God had a plan throughout history to engage with all peoples throughout the world. I'm just going to bring up one interesting verse here. It's Amos 9:7. And God is talking, and it's like, Israelites, are you not like the Cushites to me? This is the Lord's declaration. Didn't I bring Israel from the land of Egypt, and the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Arameans from Kir? Now, this verse might be a little bit obscure, and I'm pretty sure you haven't heard too many sermons on it. But if you read through this, God is comparing his work with the Israelites, bring them out of Egypt into the promised land, to how he's engaged the Cushites, how he's engaged the Philistines, how he's engaged the Arameans. Now, think through that. That means God is and has been active at work in all people. God is the God of every nation. And there are stories of God's work in those nations long before the church ever even existed. Now, it's interesting to note that the difference between the Israelites and, say, the Cushites or the Philistines or the Arameans was they knew the name of the God who brought them through these places. They were engaged by a God on a personal level, on an intentionally personal first name basis, let's say that, where these others kind of knew God was working in there, or knew that they were getting blessed, knew the blessings of God, but maybe not knowing the name of God. And we can see this idea of God constantly at work in all people. We see it in Paul's sermon from the at the Areopagus in Athens, talking about the unknown God and how God has blessed all people, but now he's trying to get them to know him and hold them accountable for that. And we see him talking about things in Romans 1, where it's the invisible characteristics of God were known to people, and they are going to be held accountable to that. Now, God has been at work in all people, yet he specifically chose to work with Israel in a special way. But it might be different than what we assume it to be. If we look at Genesis 1 through 3, when God first engages Abraham, he's going to bless Abraham and the nation of Israel in a way that blesses all other nations. In Exodus 19:4 through 6, he's making the entire nation a nation of priests. And who will they be priests for? Well, you're priests for somebody else. You intercede for somebody different than yourself. If you are a priest, you're interceding for somebody other than yourself. So that would make them the nation of Israel, intended to be a priest for all nations. And then we see Psalm 67, where the intent of God is to have all the nations worship him. Look at it this way. Psalm 67. May God be gracious to us and bless us. Look on us with favor, so that your way may be known on the earth, your salvation among all nations. Let the peoples praise you, God. Let all the peoples praise you. Let the nations rejoice and shout for joy, for you judge the people with fairness and lead the nations on earth. Let the peoples praise you, God. Let all the peoples praise you. The earth has produced its harvest, God. Our God blesses us. God will bless us, and all the ends of the earth will fear him. Israel was used by God to reach all nations. Now, it's interesting to know the difference between there was a different strategy going on here between Israel and the church. God put Israel in the center and was bringing all the nations to Jerusalem, to the mountain of God. God put Israel in a place where there was a huge traffic coming from all the other places and let them be a conspicuous people there in the middle. Whereas it seems with the church, God has sent us out into the nations. So it's a different sort of idea, but the end goal is to make God known through the nations. And just looking at this verse here, a couple verses here, this is the fulfillment of that plan is in heaven as we see it. Revelation 5:9-10. And they sang a new song. You are worthy to take the scroll, to open its seals, because you were slaughtered and you redeemed people for God by your blood from every tribe and language and people and nation. You made them a kingdom and priests to our God, and they will reign on the earth. In Revelation 7:9-10 says very similar. After this I looked, and there was a vast multitude from every nation, tribe, people, and language, which no one could number, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. They were robed in white with palm branches in their hands, and they cried out in a loud voice, Salvation belongs to our God, who is seated on the throne, and unto the Lamb. And we see that the goal, the end game, what heaven is like, is a place where every nation, tribe, people, and language is worshiping Christ and worshiping God together. John Piper says missions exist where worship doesn't. Well, in heaven, we see the fulfillment of that mission goal of reaching all nations to be fulfilled with all nations worshiping Christ. It's interesting to note, and I just want to point this out, that John, a first century Jewish guy, gets a revelation of what heaven is like. And somehow, in the heavenly form of who these people are, he is still able to recognize that every nation, tribe, people, and language are gathered around the throne. So there is something about us that is still distinct. Our differences are still able to be seen by John. Our language is still able to be heard in some way by John to know that there are multiple nations, multiple tribes, multiple people, and multiple languages. Heaven creates a picture of perfection gathered around the throne of God, worshiping Him, that is diverse but not divided, that is united but definitely not uniform. This is how heaven should be. And this is the goal of missions, to produce a heaven that is of every nation, tribe, people, and language. Thank you for joining me. There are two ways to continue this conversation: live Monday nights, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time via Zoom, and these weekly wrap ups on YouTube and WordPress. Also, you can follow me on social media: Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, WordPress, YouTube. All those links are in the description. Thank you for joining me, and I hope to continue this conversation soon.